Hello, welcome back to Chapter 8. So, we're talking about this idea of differences, right? And that in a capitalist economic system, you have to have a difference between something of high value or low value, because as we said right here, even development would destroy profit. And let's use an example. And let's talk about the profit cycle of an item. So, let's start with the iPhone, right? So, first of all, how many of you actually have a phone that is older than 5 years old? And I'm going to guess usually one or two people. Now, we've had cellular phones since the 1970s, and we've had smartphones for about 10 years now. But why do we always get new phones every year? Is the iPhone 15 or whatever we're doing really that much different than the iPhone 14? It might be a little faster, it might have a slightly bigger camera, but for the most part, they're still a phone with a camera and a mini computer, right? The differences are incremental, they're not huge. It's not like going from a phone with a cord on the wall to a satellite technology enabled phone. What's the difference? And let's explain that in detail. So let's start right now. We're on the iPhone 15, hypothetically. But Apple is getting ready for the iPhone 16. So right now, at the Apple Labs in California, they're working on the programming and they're trying to make it out so all these people are working and getting paid to work on a phone that is not for sale yet. So there's no profit. So if anything, they're losing money. But eventually, they get it ready to go as best they can. And on July 1st, 2017, or whatever day you want to pick, the iPhone 16 comes out, right? And everyone gets in line and they start selling the phone. And as they start to sell the phone, now they start to make back some money. Their profit begins to grow. And after a while, they start being able to turn a profit, right? And that's the whole idea in capitalism. It's to turn a profit, to make money, to make more money than you spend. So as sales continue to increase and everyone's getting the iPhone 16, the profit really grows. But at a certain point, everybody who owns an iPhone 16 owns it, right? At a certain point, they've sold as many as they're going to sell. So they might sell a few more here or there, as a replacement or someone coming late to the game. But for the most part, they've pretty much sold it. Everyone who wants to upgrade has upgraded. And so now, as the sales drop, right? And it's still a valid piece of technology, but the profit begins to drop. So at a certain point, there's no profit in it anymore. You've sold it all, right? If you make a really good phone and everyone wants your phone, then eventually everyone owns it and they're not going to buy two, right? This isn't like food, which has to constantly be replaced, right? So what happens? They start working over here again, and this kind of comes back over here on the iPhone 17. They start making a new product because that's how they're going to increase sales. In a capitalist economic system, you have this constant cycle of growth of profit, loss of profit. Because in capitalism, and here's the thing, capitalism at its purest sense is an economic system where you gather capital or money, you make money. If you get all the money, you're a perfect capitalist. But if you've done that, then no one else has any money left to give you. And so if you make the best phone in a capitalist system, then all of a sudden there's no one left to sell phones to. You don't make a profit anymore. And this can be applied to many things. If you think about real estate or land, as a neighborhood becomes more popular and the rents go up and the price of land goes up, at a certain point, it's going to peak. People are only going to pay so much to rent. It's not going to go on indefinitely. And when that happens, when a neighborhood is fully tricked out, you could say, the rent is as high as it's going to get, what happens is they move on to another neighborhood. This is how neighborhoods become popular or less popular over time when it comes to rent and prices. In the 1950s and 60s, Lincoln Park was a Puerto Rican neighborhood. In fact, many people called it the North Side Slum. It was a very low-income neighborhood, mainly Puerto Rican. In the 1960s, people came in and bought the houses and rehabbed them and fixed them up and started charging more rent. And the people that were poor had to leave. They couldn't afford it, and they moved on, which allowed even more buildings to be rehabbed or finished and charging more rent. And Lincoln Park today, very, very expensive neighborhood. And this cycle is playing out right now in neighborhoods like Pilsen on the southwest side of the city. We're going to talk about gentrification at the end of the semester, but for now, that is kind of in a nutshell what happens with this. Another way of looking at that is in a capitalist society, you tend to get these gaps, right? And this chart represents in any one area of a country. So here's Britain, here's the United States. This is what the average the average poor person makes, the poorest number, as a percent of the national average income, and the richest person. So the United States, the poorest person makes in this area makes about 75% of the average income, whereas the richest person makes a little over 350% of the national average. So you can see here that most people in Italy, Germany, Japan are much closer to the average. There's not a big gap. Not so here in the United States or China. And here's another way of looking at it. This chart represents, between 1989 and 2013, the value of the American society. Everything in here represents, in dollars, wealth. So anything that has value, so cash, savings account, buildings, cars, anything that has value. And you can see that in this chart, and let's just say in the year 2007, this area here in the light purple, this area of wealth, of the total wealth of the country, was owned by the top 10%. 10% of the American public owned this much value. So in other words, in our classroom, say we have 30 students, and we counted all the wealth that we all own, our clothing, our money, our cars, everything in that room. That would mean that in this room, basically this huge chunk, which is easily over half of the total wealth of the country, of the classroom, would be controlled by 3 people. And 27 people would hold the last 15%. Right? So currently, in the United States, 1% of the population owns 40% of all the wealth in this country. Think about that. 1% of the population owns almost half the wealth. Another way of looking at it is that 90% of the American public only hold 25% of all value in this country. And that's a pretty telling statistic. There is a wide gap between the richest and the poorest. And that is something that capitalism does. Here's another example that we see in Chicago. This goes maps by neighborhood. The color scale indicates its what they call hardship index. And this is a numeric statistic that is made by looking at things like the amount of people in poverty in a neighborhood, what is the unemployment rate, what is the number of people who don't have a high school or college diploma, the average income. And this probably is not a surprise to you that the wealthier neighborhoods tend to be on the north side and the lakefront, and the poorer neighborhoods tend to be in the west and south sides, right? So if you are coming to downtown right here for school, when we did have school downtown, right? And if you were coming from the south and west sides, your commute to school, you went through areas that had much different levels of affluence, okay? So what causes these clusters? Why does the north side tend to have more income than the south side? And here's an example. What causes these clusters? Resources. What is pulling people to these areas? Well, on the north side, right, there's a lot of amenities. There's more expensive, more luxury housing if you have the money, better access to transit. You have the lakefront right there, developed as a park. Lots of jobs in that area and schools like DePaul and Loyola. You have that. Less crime. Okay. You also have, to kind of go with that, a concentration of firms and labor. In Chicago right now, the big driver in our economic engine is services. So legal firms, advertising, computer technology, and that is a big thing, and that concentrates on the north side and downtown, which pulls people to it. These two items here create number 3. You need the subsidiary trades. So if there's a lot of people living and working in an area and making good money and making decent money, you have to have the grocery stores. You have to have the gas stations. You have to have the daycare centers. All those things that service that. Delivery services like UPS or FedEx. And then another thing that happens is when you have this kind of cluster of economic activity, you have this idea of innovation. So in Chicago, if one technology company is doing one thing very well, other companies see that and they say, well, we can do that. And those ideas that are innovative spill over. It's competition in many ways. All of these combine to create what they call a thick market. You've got the right materials, the right people, the right resources. So you've got this very dynamic area, much like cumulative causation of growth, that basically feeds itself. And it allows things to develop. And you have these clusters of high economic activity, which pulls away from the areas of low activity. Okay. Now that isn't always the case. There can be some things that disrupt that. A good example would be if, say, the value of land goes up so much. If all of this creates so much demand that rent for an office is too expensive for new firms to go there and rent, they're going to find somewhere else. Or, for instance, in the case of Detroit in the 1950s, as they grew with the automotion industry making cars, and wages went up, at a certain point, auto manufacturers went to other countries where it was cheaper for labor. So those can stop that. Okay. There are some industries that do defy that. They call those technopoles. For instance, Silicon Valley in California, where Google and Apple are, even though we have all this happening, which has driven real estate costs up, it's crazy. A studio apartment in San Francisco goes for between $2,500 to $3,000 a month. So that is making it very hard to recruit labor, but yet for some reason there is still enough growth to keep that going on. This is actually, you can see this in how economic clusters of value in the U.S. have changed in the last 50 years. Currently in the United States, the most dynamic areas economically are brain hubs. Areas where the industry is using your brain. So it's education, it's medical, it's biotechnology, it is computer technology. That's the main driver. We're not so much making cars or washing or dryers or refrigerators anymore. And that is because those areas are dying off. This is the Rust Belt. They call this area, it's basically from Wisconsin and Chicago through to Pittsburgh, the Midwest. In the 1900s, they started drilling for oil here and coal in Pennsylvania, and Pittsburgh became the center of the steel industry, which we talked about in that last chapter about Kondratiev cycles. And then in Detroit, Henry Ford started making automobiles, which needed steel and oil. So you have automobiles here, steel here. Ohio developed a lot of industries to making automobile parts, like tires. So Firestone and Goodyear are both based in Ohio. So all this area was based around heavy manufacturing. Chicago and Gary, Indiana in the 1900s had the world's largest steel mills. But as we talked about last chapter, industrial activity has moved overseas to other countries like Korea and Taiwan and Japan. And what's happening now is this area, populations are shrinking. Detroit has lost over 50% of its population from the 1960s. If you've driven through Gary, Indiana, which is right across the border from Chicago, it is a ghost town. The cities that have remained viable, like Pittsburgh and Chicago, changed their focus to innovation. Pittsburgh now is known as an educational center. There's many colleges there. Chicago is known as one of the centers of high-tech technology, legal services, and advertising. And so they've made that switch. They've been able to not fade away like, say, many parts of Chicago or Gary, Indiana, or Detroit. So we're going to pause here because I know y'all kind of need to get up and stretch and maybe have a cup of coffee, and we'll be back in just a moment.